The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, author Christopher Witko on his new book about how states are taking the lead against economic inequality. Advocate Kellie Dupree on how voters are making a powerful impact with ballot measures. And Bill Press talks with Steve Cotton of the International Transport Workers Federation on the global impact of labor unions. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight, and follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. Christopher Witko is a scholar who studies the politics and policies of job creation and economic fairness. He says states have picked up the fight where the federal government has failed. And we say hello to Christopher Witko, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Master of Public Administration program at the University of South Carolina, and co-author with William Franco of The New Economic Populism, How States Respond to Economic Inequality. Chris Witko, thank you so much for joining us today on America's Democrats podcast.
It's my pleasure to join you. Thanks a lot for having me.
Oh, you're quite welcome, and the pleasure is ours. Populism, it's a word we hear a lot in recent times, often in negative ways from a progressive point of view. What is your definition of economic populism?
Yes, populism is viewed as a negative thing by lots of just people in the media and even by scholars, and there's kind of lots of good reasons for that. Populism has come to be associated over the years with a political style that kind of is demagogic, in which scapegoats certain populations, and I think we see that happening in a lot of different countries today. And that's a long part of the American tradition of populism, which always had a pretty strong liberal element going back to the early populist movement in the late 1800s. We obviously don't mean it that way, because we think economic populism is a good thing in a lot of ways. We really are just simply meaning that economic policies that are broadly popular with the public and which are going to be good for most people. That's what we mean by economic populism.
And your book, of course, is called The New Economic Populism, which, of course, begs the question, what was the old economic populism and what's changed?
Yeah, well, by populism, we just mean what I basically just said. So we talk about how a bunch of states are actually starting to do things to address inequality, like raise the minimum wage, increase taxes on the wealthy, expand tax credits for low-income workers and things like that. And we think of these actions as populist because as the federal government has proven to be less responsive to public preferences and needs, and there's quite a bit of research indicating that, the states are becoming an important area where majoritarian policymaking aimed at reducing the income gap can take place. And we think it's new because really, since the New Deal, we've become accustomed to thinking of the federal government as the level of government that should be addressing these inequalities. And that's really not happening now. And so we think in some ways what's new, which is the states addressing these problems, is really old, because before the New Deal, it was really the states taking the lead on these issues, addressing, the problems of industrialization and stuff like that, which the federal government lagged on. And we're seeing a really similar thing today with responses to inequality.
Sure. Now, historically, how do you explain the failure at the national level to address issues of economic inequality and equity?
Yeah, well, I've done some other research on this with Peter Enns and Nathan Kelly and Jana Morgan, and there's been a lot of other research on this. But basically, there's really two reasons why the federal government has failed to address inequality. And one is, if of course, inequality is going to be a greater priority for the Democratic Party. But what we saw in the 80s and 90s is that as inequality really was taking off, the Democratic Party did, in some respects, become more conservative. On things like financial regulation, welfare reform was a pretty tough bill from the perspective of a lot of poverty advocates and things like that. It's not clear to me that trend is getting worse or continuing, but that was really important during the 80s and 90s. And then even if you get a more liberal Democratic Party in charge of both chambers of Congress and the White House, even so, it's really, really hard to get things done at the federal level due to all the veto points that exist. And, we saw this obviously most notably with Obamacare in recent years, where that bill had to really be watered down to get through those veto points, the 60 votes in the Senate and so forth. And we argue in the book that really these veto points are even more problematic for getting policy done during periods of inequality, because the people who are benefiting from inequality and amassing more financial assets can use those in the political and policy process to block policy change.
We're speaking with Christopher Witko, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Master of Public Administration program at the University of South Carolina. Also co-author with William Franco of The New Economic Populism, How States Respond to Economic Inequality. Chris, what are some noteworthy examples of states taking the lead on progressive economic issues?
Yeah, I think some of them are the usual suspects. If I asked you what states you think are, you'd probably say, I would imagine California, and that's true. We talk about a tax increase in California that was up on upper income earners a few years ago in the book. But California has done a lot and has always been a pretty innovative state, or at least for the last several decades. But actually, it's not just these kind of big liberal states that you would expect to be doing these sorts of things. You see in other states, particularly where there's the initiative, even in relatively conservative states, you have some egalitarian policy changes taking place. So South Dakota is an example. A few years ago, they enacted a pretty large minimum wage increase and then indexed that to changes in the cost of living. And the legislature even tried to get that repealed, and voters rejected that. And then you're seeing other places that are not quite conservative or liberal, but places like Nevada, where, a Republican governor oversaw a pretty large tax hike that raised a lot more revenue for government in the last few years. So we can't pinpoint. It's happening in a lot of different states, but it's happening different ways in different states.
And it is interesting that it's going beyond just, as you say, the big blue left-leaning states and that sort of thing. And certain states are certainly stronger than others. What are the conditions at the state level that make them more likely to address inequality?
Yeah, so a big thing running through the book is that we argue that where the public is more aware of and concerned about inequality, you're going to see more responsiveness to inequality. And that makes sense just because it's people that are voting for politicians and contributing to interest group campaigns and so forth. Where you have stronger unions, that's not too surprising. You'd expect to see more egalitarian policymaking, of course, where you have liberal politicians. But then the initiative is something that can really matter in areas where you don't have necessarily the liberal politicians and the unions, because policies that you might think of as liberal, like the minimum wage, are really very popular with Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives. So, if you have all of these things, like in California, you're going to have a lot more opportunities for egalitarian policy change. But even where you only have something like the initiative, we've seen in states like Missouri and South Dakota in recent years, they've increased their minimum wages through that process.
When we see states kind of collectively start building up that minimum wage, I mean, obviously from the federal level, there's been a lot of pushback, and nothing happens. But all of a sudden, a bunch of states start popping up, and more of them do it. Is that how you get nowadays? Is that how you get it to work on the federal level? I mean, do they all of a sudden say, oh, okay, well, enough states are for it, so we'll go ahead and raise it?
Well, I think that's absolutely something that would factor into federal decision making. I mean, once most states and large swaths of the population have a minimum wage of $10 or more, yeah, there should be kind of less resistance to that, because a lot of your businesses have already adjusted. the businesses that would normally be against minimum wage increases. But more generally, you do see, historically, if you look at things like the creation of the minimum wage initially, things like workers' compensation insurance, hour laws, maximum hour laws, and things like that. These things all started at the state level, took decades to get to the federal level. So we do see this kind of vertical policy diffusion up from the states to the federal government throughout history. And the good thing is about the laboratories of democracy, as they're sometimes called, is that, once a bunch of policies spread in the states, then that does put things onto the federal agenda over time.
Yeah, and I think it's important to underscore that as you're heading into midterms and your local elections and things, people need to keep that in mind, and you need to get out and vote during those because they end up being more important, perhaps, than some of the national races that we go out for every 4 years and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
What are the implications of your work for advocates of progressive economic policies in terms of how they focus their efforts?
Yeah, I think, Theda Skocpol was on one of your podcasts a couple of years ago talking about how the left and progressives have done a really poor job of focusing on the states for policy change, and that the conservatives, she has a study with Alex Hertel Fernandez that looks at kind of the Koch brothers network and the stuff they've done in the states. And what they've been able to accomplish by focusing on states is getting a lot of policy enacted. So a lot of these anti-union policies that we've seen in recent years are the product of those efforts. So you get direct impacts on policy, but you also start to support candidates and get a bench going for people that can run for the federal office. And progressive organizations have really focused much more on the federal government, so they don't have a bench in the states. Of course, they lost, you might say, bigly in 2010 and 2014 in those state elections. So most of your states are controlled by Republicans now, and that has important policy implications. And there's some of these low-hanging fruit things in terms of policy that could be done in a lot of states, even conservative states that have the initiative, like increasing the minimum wage and things like that. So people are just missing a lot of opportunities if they focus only on the federal government. Now, obviously, you can't ignore what's happening at the federal level, but I do think the balance has been way out of whack when you consider that if the Democrats do take over both houses of Congress following the 2018 election, yeah, they'll be able to stop Trump and the Republicans from doing a lot of things that they would not like to see happen, and that's a good thing from their perspective. But it's not going to lead to any positive policy changes that are going to actually improve the lives of people. But there's a lot of states where that can actually happen.
Well, and even though you cite national politicians as being ineffective on these issues, does that mean we should abandon hope that Congress could be effective?
No, it doesn't mean we should abandon hope that Congress can be effective. It means we should be extremely realistic about what Congress can accomplish in the short term and then adjust resources accordingly. That would be what I would recommend to, activists in the Democratic Party. But personally, I don't think that this idea that we want more egalitarian policy, higher minimum wages and things like that is actually a Democratic goal. I think that's just an American goal. I think the vast majority of Americans, Democrats, Republicans, want to have an economy that works better for everyone. And an important part of making that happen is policy change in the states.
Yeah, absolutely, and actually, I bet you Republicans and Democrats, the population in general, probably agree on more things than they disagree on. But for a lot of reasons, we still fight and butt our heads over stuff. It's like, wait a minute,
absolutely,
we all want the same thing.
Yeah, if you look at the minimum wage, if you look at whether people think billionaires should be paying more taxes, these have overwhelming support among Democrats, Republicans, liberals, conservatives, and it would be fantastic if we could focus more on those issues on which we pretty well, I wouldn't say all agree, but a lot of people agree in both parties across the ideological spectrum. And I think there's more room, frankly, right now for pragmatism at the state level on a lot of these things than there is at the federal level.
Before we let you go, how would you advise voters as they approach the midterm elections?
Well, I think, focus on, of course, the top of the ballot stuff, Congress and things like that. But, most of your states are going to have elections coming up in the fall. So I hope people put some thought into those. And we'll again see some ballot initiatives on things like the minimum wage, union rights, and people need to be cognizant of those and vote in line with their policy preferences on those. A lot of the Congress gets a lot more media attention and stuff like that, but these state races can be really important.
That's what affects me more on a day-to-day basis than any of the national races. It's, my local politicians in the jurisdiction that I live, they make the decisions that affect life in my neighborhood. So it's extremely important for people to get out and vote.
Indeed.
Christopher Witko, Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of the Master of Public Administration program at the University of South Carolina. He's also co-author with William Franco of The New Economic Populism, How States Respond to Economic Inequality, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Chris, thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate it and look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
You're quite welcome. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, the transformative reach of ballot measures for progressive change. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The Koch brothers believe that their great wealth entitles them to rule over the many. So, for decades, they've been running a surreptitious assault on the rules that protect the majority of us from their abuse. From whacking our voting rights to busting unions, their plutocratic intent is nothing less than to pull a coup on democracy, installing a government of, by, and for the super-rich. They've enlisted a secretive cadre of other billionaires who share their extreme kleptocratic belief that 1, property rights of the rich are more important than the people's political rights. 2, that majority rule is not a good form of governing. And 3, that the makers, as the billionaires dubbed themselves, should be able to overrule collective actions of the lower classes, whom they call takers. They've created a complex, sophisticated web of right-wing front groups that have already corporatized a slew of our most basic laws and institutions. And they've gained a chokehold on nearly every level of government, including our courts and whole states like Wisconsin, North Carolina, and Texas. To carry out their attacks, they've essentially taken over the Republican Party. Even more shocking than the arrogance of this unprecedented power grab by the conspiracy of billionaires is its quiet success. The Koch coup crept up on us because it abhorred publicity and couched each move as an independent effort by a separate group. Then, the conspirators backed the Supreme Court's outrageous 2010 Citizens United decision, decreeing that unlimited corporate spending is allowed because it's, quote, free speech. Only then did Americans begin waking up to the reality that the Kochs were making an assault on democracy itself. This is Jim Hightower saying, to learn more, check out the extensive Koch web files at the Center for Media and Democracy at exposedbycmd.org/Koch.
Need an antidote to the progressive blues? Want some good news about how grassroots folks are rebelling against the corporate powers and winning? Well, here's an easy-to-swallow pill for you, the Hightower Lowdown. Hightower's monthly newsletter will give you the lowdown, even as it lifts you up. It's 4 pages a month, jam-packed with facts you can use, actions you can take, and Jim's own Texas humor, all for only $15 a year. To become a lowdowner, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Kellie Dupree has made a career advocating for progressive change. Now she's helping citizens use the power of ballot measures to fight for social justice. And we say hello to Kellie Dupree, Director of Partnerships and Training at the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center. Kellie Dupree, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's certainly our pleasure. And let's start by talking about the role of ballot initiatives in American democracy. What can a ballot initiative accomplish where other political strategies may fail?
I think in our current political climate, ballot measures actually are one of the most powerful tools that are available for progressive change. We're seeing one-party monopolies in states across the country and in our federal government, and because of that, things just aren't even being discussed in state legislatures. So ballot initiatives are an opportunity for grassroots organizations and citizens to really take up the issues that care about them, that affect them, and then take those to the ballot and get these policies implemented.
Kind of getting the voice back to the people, I guess, on a lot of levels. Yep,
exactly.
Now,
we think of it as a very powerful way for people to have direct impact.
Yeah, absolutely. And on the homepage of your organization, it states that ballot measures originated as a check on corporate influence. Tell us that story, if you will.
Sure. So the modern ballot measure actually really started out in California a little over 100 years ago at this point. Hiram Johnson actually ran for governor on a platform that he wanted to take power back from the railroads. At the time, the Southern Pacific Railroad was really kind of running the state of California. Anything they wanted, the legislature passed, and progressives in the state really wanted that to stop. So he ran on a platform that he would give power back to citizens and actually created the modern ballot initiative process in the state. And they were able to then implement some changes through that process that the legislature wasn't willing to take on. And we've seen that kind of continue for quite a while, for the first few decades, with the ballot initiative process. I think it was in the 80s and 90s that we saw a shift back to it being conservatives really taking it back to try to use it to actually grow corporate power. And then we're seeing a shift again in the 2000s to where progressives are using it more as a tool, but it's always been intended as a way for citizens to take back power that's being denied to them.
Mm-hmm. And your organization describes itself as the only progressive organization that works across the many policy, organizing, and political groups to analyze and support the ballot measure landscape. Tell us more about what your organization does and why ballot measures are such an important tool for progressive causes.
Yeah, so as I stated earlier, it's a little bit in a lot of states, it's the only tool that people can really use to get things accomplished. In states where the legislature and the governor's office and all the statewide offices are held by conservatives, usually the issues that we care about that can actually improve people's lives are not being brought forward. And ballot measures really give a tool to help citizens get the policies they need. And this year, we're seeing people use ballot measures to really advocate for issues that we've been talking about in the progressive community for a long time around economy and democracy and funding public services. And at BISC, we actually try to help campaigns from beginning, thinking about the idea, all the way through to implementation. So we provide help in a lot of different ways. We do strategic assistance to organizations and campaigns directly who are thinking about getting things on the ballot. We do training, teaching people the actual steps of how you run a ballot measure campaign, because it actually is quite different from candidate campaigns. We also have a program that we're calling, a strategy rather, that we call the Roadmap to 2020, which is we're working to create a national proactive ballot measure strategy focused in the 11 most frequent ballot measure states across the country to try to move forward policies over a number of years to continue to improve people's lives.
We're speaking with Kellie Dupree, Director of Partnerships and Training at the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, and talking about ballot initiatives. Specifically, Kellie, in the area of economics and equity, what are some of the ballot measures that you're seeing and supporting?
This year, we're seeing campaigns around earned sick time for workers, as well as raising the minimum wage. Specifically, we're seeing those campaigns in Michigan, in Washington, D.C., in Colorado, potentially in Colorado, in Massachusetts. And then also we're seeing campaigns around actually raising revenue to fund public schools and public services, especially in Arizona and Colorado. And we see this really as a continuation of what we've been seeing teachers do across the country when they actually take to the streets to fight for better funding for their schools and for their own salaries. This is an attempt to actually get that written into state law so that this isn't something they have to march on repeatedly.
Mm-hmm. And, it's interesting because of the states that you're mentioning there as we're talking about this. We're not talking about just blue, just red. This is a mix. This is everybody getting involved with ballot initiatives.
Yeah, ballot measures are often a nonpartisan issue. Sometimes people try to make the topic partisan, but what we find is ballot measures are equally successful, whether it's in a red or a blue state. In years like 2014, where Democrats didn't do really well at the ballot, states like Nebraska and Arkansas were voting to raise the minimum wage. People will vote to improve their lives if they get the chance.
Yeah, and regardless of what party they're in or support.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what are some of the other trends and successes in ballot initiatives that we should be paying attention to?
I think another big trend that people should be keeping an eye out for is things around voting and access to voting. We're seeing some more initiatives this year to try to expand access to voting and make it easier for people to register. And I think we're going to continue to see that trend over the next few elections, because part of having a strong democracy is making sure everyone has access to it. I also think we're going to be seeing an increase in criminal justice reform measures. There's one in Florida this year that's been getting a lot of attention for the 2018 ballot around rights restoration, giving for people who have served their time and are out of prison, letting them get their right to vote back. We're seeing changes in how what is classified as a felony and not a felony, and how people are treated, and how we can actually help people re-enter society after they've served their time. So I think we're going to see more initiatives around that as well. And then there are actually some trends that I think people need to keep an eye on the defensive side, where we're actually trying to protect against really bad measures, attacks on the trans community, attacks on immigrants, and attacks on labor's right to organize. We're really seeing those start to ramp up, and we think it's an important thing to keep an eye on, and probably an unfortunate trend we're going to see.
Yeah. Now, given that ballot measures can be so successful, especially with regard to progressive interests, are you seeing any backlash? I mean, for example, what's been happening in Maine?
Yeah, we definitely are starting to see backlash. The more successful ballot measures are, the more state legislatures and governors are trying to take steps to make it harder to implement these things. Maine's a really good example of a state where the Governor LePage has decided that he doesn't have to implement ballot measures. He feels that there is no requirement on him to follow the will of the voters. He actually has said in media interviews that he thinks a ballot initiative is just a recommendation, even though in Maine there are statutes and constitutional amendments that voters have said they wanted to have happen. So in states like what's happening in Maine and what's happened in South Dakota as well, where the legislature overturned an ethics package that the voters passed in 2016, and then have spent the last 2 years trying to get rid of the ballot measure process in the state, we're really seeing pretty blatant undermining of the voices of voters. And at this, we actually have a program that we call our Ballot Integrity Program, where we're tracking these attacks on the process and trying to support states as they fight back. And what we've seen from our national perspective is that this is actually a trend. We tracked more than 40 pieces of legislation in more than 20 states this year. And we know that conservatives are trying to do everything they can to make ballot measures inaccessible to average voters. So that's something that we've been really paying attention to and expect, if we have great success in 2018, we expect to be fighting this in the legislatures and in the courts in 2019.
Yeah, and fingers crossed that ball continues to roll and get bigger and bigger. We're speaking to Kellie Dupree, Director of Partnerships and Training at the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, and that kind of leads me to my next question when I mentioned training. If one of our listeners was interested in starting a ballot campaign, what do they need to do? I mean, this is incredibly hard work.
It is. It is a lot of hard work, and while it can be grassroots, it's also, we have to admit, it can be expensive. So I think when people if they're thinking about moving forward with an issue, we always try to tell people they want to think of a few things right away. Is this an issue that's actually relevant to the people in your community or the community you're trying to help? It's sometimes people can think that something that's incredibly important to them is not as important to their neighbors. And you want to make sure that if you're moving forward with this, it's something that people will get behind you and work in coalition with you on. And we also think it's really important that people work in coalition. You want to have partners that support you from all aspects of your community, and make sure all different groups are represented and have a voice. You want to think about the political environment, because some years may not be the best year to run it, depending on who's going to be showing up at the polls and what else is on the ballot. And you want to think about your actual ability to execute the campaign. And this is where we ask people to really think about the time they have available, the people they have available, and we like to call it treasure, which is the resources. And that can be money, that can be office space. But you want to kind of have thought those things through before you move forward with the campaign.
There was, as you were answering the question, it made me think of something. We're coming up on midterm elections, of course. Is there any sort of trend where it's better to wait because midterm elections don't attract as many voters that you don't do it then, but you wait for the every 4 year? Is there any sort of trend that works that way?
I wouldn't say it's a trend, but it's a decision that really can be impacted by what kind of voters you think you need for your issue.
Sure.
It can often be a question of, are you needing to educate a lot of voters on the issue, which happens often with things related to taxes. So a smaller electorate can actually be helpful because it's easier to make sure you're actually talking to all of them. But some issues, it's just about turnout, and you want to make sure that people actually know about the ballot. And if they know about it, they'll probably vote for it. So a more crowded election can be helpful. So it's really about individual bandwidth for campaigns.
Gotcha.
Which election they want to run on.
Yeah, and getting out and doing a lot of legwork, and building that.
Yep.
And as you said, building that coalition, that's really a big part too. So, Kellie, how can listeners learn more about ballot measures and your work?
They can go to our website, which is ballot.org, and learn a lot about our work. They can learn how to access our training program and some of our other resources that way as well.
Fantastic. Ballot.org. Very easy to remember as long as I can get it out. Ballot.org. Kellie Dupree, Director of Partnerships and Training at the Ballot Initiative Strategy Center, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. Kellie, thank you so much for your time. We wish you the best of luck, and we look forward to having you back again with us soon.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press talks with Steve Cotton, General Secretary of the Transport Workers Federation.
Mr. Steve Cotton. Hey, Steve, it's good to see you.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you for coming in. Lots to talk about. I want to find out a lot more about what you're doing and about the state of working families around the nation. We don't get a chance to focus on that much. But we've been talking about news of the day here in this country for the last 40 minutes or so. Generating some comments, Peter?
Yes, indeed. We are on Twitter at BP Show. Lots of different comments on, well, the child separation policy.
Yeah.
Let's start with Matthew Naughton. He says, how disgusting is it that Trump is taking credit to reunite the children with their parents when it was his policy that caused this to begin with? My man Romaine in Chicago says, what's so sad is that Donald Trump was bragging about how much richer he is than those idiots, and they are the ones cheering for him.
Yeah, at a rally last night, right. That's insane.
Yeah, and on the congressional picnic, you mentioned all the food that's going to be wasted. Walker Ogden says, I am sure that Donnie will sign an executive order to designate the food already prepared to be given to the homeless. I would not count.
Or maybe he'll send it out to those kids in those tents in the desert, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, for
that's
sure.
his idea of compassion, I guess.
Yeah,
It'll probably be served on the menu at a Trump hotel is probably what's going to happen.
You know what? I'll bet you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right to they'll buy used steaks.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be very on brand for Donald Trump. If you have a comment, by the way, find us on Twitter at BP Show. Make sure you follow us there, and any comment that you give, we'll take a look at it. We'll see them.
All right, you got it. Thanks, Peter. Steve Cotton with the International Transport Workers Federation, ITF, right?
That's it. Yep.
So the stuff that you sent me, you represent 670 different unions in 147 different countries, with a total of 19.7 million transport workers. Is that the largest sector?
I wish I'd love to say it was, but there are other what we call global union federations, and those members come by way of the national unions. So Teamsters are one of our biggest affiliates in North America. We have a number of others. So they put all their members in, and it's our job to coordinate strategies across all of the transport sectors.
I'm surprised to hear that 147 countries, unions exist and are active in 147 countries.
We're very lucky.
We're very tied in. I'm very supportive. I'm a lifetime union member myself, and unions in this country, but I don't think of it on a global scale.
So our job is to make sure that the brotherhood, the sisterhood, the solidarity is produced globally. And part of what we'll talk about today is how historically we've worked coordinating at the United Nations, the International Labour Organization, those kind of intergovernment agencies. Today, the ITF is more dynamic in tackling multinationals and how they behave in different parts in the world. And it's quite clear there's many North American-owned companies that have responsible union relationships in North America, good relations, and then they go to other parts of the world, perhaps less developed, less union strong, and behave in different ways. And one of the companies we'll talk about today is it doesn't have good relationships here, but it's a global challenge. And we have some big unions in Russia, big unions in Asia. The railway union that we have in Russia is 1.7 million members. Very big.
Right, yeah. I want to ask you about some of these companies, some of the bad players that you alluded to. But in terms of working conditions, wages, benefits, how do American workers stand with the rest of the world? Are we leading the world? Are we on par with the world? And where are things best? Like, you're from the UK.
That's a really good question. I think America, where there are good companies that have good industrial relations and a good respect for their workers, you have some of the better contracts. But also, I would say probably United States, for such a wealthy country, has the extremes, where you have people working for below minimum wage and non-union rights. So the package is kind of diverse. And where unions have been successful in North America and have got medical, welfare, pension plans, saving plans, sometimes it's to their disadvantage to get the other workers into that situation because employers use that as a rule to fight against unions. If I was to pick probably some of the best places in the world, I'd say still the Nordic countries have some of the most balanced social economic strategies, both governmentally and then in partnership with
what we would call Scandinavian countries?
Yeah. So right. If I was picking one today, I'd say Sweden, but Finland, they're very entwined with government policy, and the unions are very well respected in the social dynamic. So,
and the membership level is higher?
Very high, up in the 90s.
Yeah, really? In the 90s?
Yeah.
Wow.
And the government trusts the unions to administer the social welfare packages. So rather than fighting day by day over every element, there's a conversation with the government that says unemployment benefit, sick pay, all of those issues will be ministered by the union in partnership.
And Western Europe?
Slightly different position. Germany's still quite strong on economic power, beginning to see certain different levels of 2 tiers of employment. France, seen a lot of politics there where the government is trying to privatise the rail sector. It's very controversial.
Yeah.
There's a lot of issues constantly, and you know, we probably thank some of our North American corporate experts for exporting that kind of privatisation model. And certainly in our rail sector, that's the biggest battle to keep rail systems national and protect them. If you look at the future of the world and you look at the environmental question, we're also partnering on some of those elements about making sure that public transport remains in the hands of the public and provides a service and deals with society as a whole. We don't believe you can have effective cities economically successful, and we want economically successful cities and employers too, but you have to have a service to provide the low-cost workers to get to work in a fair and equitable way. So for us, public transport is part of planning, and we're actually looking earlier now at the process, and we believe we need to lobby mayors, federal people to make sure that workers, unions have a voice in the future of cities.
Public transit is more important than ever today for so many reasons, right? Just as cities become bigger in terms of convenience, in terms of the people being able to get to work and live close to work, and also for environmental reasons to cut down on greenhouse gases. But I just wanted to point out there are these two players in American politics, the Koch brothers, Charles and David Koch, who have done so much damage with the stuff that they've said. They're big oil people, and they just want to do away with our Environmental Protection Agency, do away with that. They've said that's their goal: do away with all environmental regulations so they can pollute as much as they want. They now have pumped millions of dollars into an effort to undermine and undo and turn back the clock on public transit. This is their latest. In addition to trying to elect as many Republicans as they can. Just as an aside, you ought to keep your eye on them because I think it's a fool's mission for them because I don't think you could turn back the clock today on public transport.
We have very strong views. There's millions of direct workers and millions of ancillary workers working in the transport sector in urban centres. If you look at the future of the world, and there are studies coming out of the World Bank and the ILO and the IMF, there's going to be a continued movement out of the countryside into urban centres. Yeah. And in order to make that effective and responsible and regulated and controlled, you need to build a strategy around your urban transportation. And it shouldn't be based on petrol-driven machines and cars. It should be built in an equitable, fair, reasonable cost mode to move people from the outskirts of town, or even look at how we plan our towns and build different centres around how do you make sure where the place of work is. But the reality has to be that the planners, and there are a number of mayors in the world, we're kind of talked to what they call the L40, which is the mayors that have a view about the environment and what the future of cities should look like. And then on behalf of the global voice of the transport workers unions, including the North Americans, but globally, we're talking to them about what the future of cities should look like. We're also talking to the World Economic Forum about what the future of cities should look like. We're in a discussion and a pilot program about, automised cars. And the study has proven in Boston here that actually the driverless cars haven't helped the congestion. Those that are wealthy enough are quite happy to get in a car and sit on their own. And our view would be, let's invest and find ways to invest in public transit, because that's the only way to build a congestion-free, smooth city that will build economy and strength.
So do you see the driverless vehicle as a threat to workers in the transport unions?
We see automation and all those issues are quite big threats, but we also believe in the power of the unions, and this isn't a question of just the individual. We believe that we should be lobbying government and policymakers to ensure that automised cars isn't the solution for congestion-free environments. We need proper, well-planned infrastructure in urban centres, and that includes health and safety, care for the disabled, all those issues that make sure society functions.
But it does mean, and I had conversations with President Hoffa about this. I mean, one of the like first targets, I think, of the automation, whatever the word is, are trucks. And I mean, I cannot conceive of going down the highway in my car with an 18-wheeler alongside of me with no driver.
So we're also in a study on that, and we've been working with the other ITF, which is a Transport Government Forum, and we're also talking to the employers, the IRU, that's the Employers Truck Association.
Yeah.
Our big problem on trucking is a shortage of drivers.
Shortage of drivers?
Shortage of drivers.
Really?
And the challenge is because the cost level has been driven down and down over time because the global supply chain, the just-in-time delivery, personal ownership, and our challenge to have strong unions representing workers. Ultimately, what do all people want? They want good, secure jobs that provide for their family. And, in North America, the trade union movement has been the success story of the middle class. What's happening now is with organisations like XPO, they're driving down the cost. Where there were good companies that had good union relationships, had good training policies for their truck drivers to be skilled. Well, let's not underestimate the job of a truck driver when we talk about the sheer weight and the cargo and the risk to society, the health and safety issues, the congestion issues. Oh, yeah. Those are very skilled jobs, and we believe that the professional driver should be recognised more as the professional driver.
Absolutely.
And rewarded financially to pick up those issues.
Yeah, I mean, you don't think about all the responsibility they have and I mean, all the skills needed to we handle that big piece of equipment. But so you mentioned this XPO. This is one of the companies that you're targeting.
XPO is a company that's an American-based company headquartered in Greenwich, Connecticut, headed by CEO Bradley Jacobs. And we basically, he has a reputation for buying up companies, decentralizing their social conditions, fighting with unions, challenging. We talked a little bit about what does a good union American contract look like? It has a salary and it has the social package. That's why people aspire to have contracts. He's a person that would fight all of those and say you shouldn't have that. He's, I think probably one of the worst things North America, and I'm a great lover of my many, many friends in this country, is kind of union busters.
Oh, yeah.
Lawyers that come along that argue that individuals shouldn't become part of a union. He operates in all of those areas. And as he moves globally, we've got a lot of challenges.
And is he buying up transit systems?
I think what we'll see, and this is also the next part of the automation question, we'll see that the global supply chain continues to change. So for the ITF and all of our affiliates, whether you're on a ship, whether you're in the docks, whether you're on a train or a truck, and warehousing, all of those issues are going to become more and more tightly aligned with more software, more data, more control about the just-in-time. Our challenge is to make sure when players like XPO come into the market, take over what were good union shops with good employers and long relationships, that we keep the power of the individual to stay strong with the union.
How do you take on a giant like that?
So that's a good question, Bill. As part of our changing strategy, we basically say, that the ITF, you act nationally, but you behave internationally. So our unions have to get together, formulate strategies, trust each other, talk to each other. I'm telling you that if you're a metro driver in Boston or you're a metro driver in Paris or London or even Delhi, your challenges are the same. You have boss, you have to meet a deadline, you have to protect the passengers. If we're talking freight, truck drivers lose so much time on borders, checks, all those issues. Our job is to make sure that all of our unions have conversations, open and frank conversations about their workplace challenges, and we run campaigns around those workplace challenges. And we go back to basics. We go back to the individual's concern and why they need unions and why we will stand up for them globally. And we were proud that we brought an international group to the XPO AGM in Paris. We were glad that Teamsters went all the way there with a delegation because their members in North America need to know that the fight, and there's a lot of quite bad operations. We've got issues. XPO have some very big clients, Verizon, Nike, Disney, DHL, Amazon. They're not they may be an unknown name to most of us, but the logistics are what move the freight, which move it from the ships to the docks, to the warehouse to the shops. And, we see that, locked away in warehousing environments. There's discrimination on gender. There's a lack of respect for health and safety regulations. And these are the kind of things, we see in kind of a North American misclassification of your job, because that then relates to what you can pay and how many hours you have to work. A lack of respect for your workers in the workplace. Treatment of disciplinary issues. We would call it social dumping, as in you try to drive the cost of labour down to the disadvantage, when in reality, and this is, I'm not an economist, but to me, the more workers earn, the more money they work, the more they spend it, the more they provide the family, and that should drive the engine of the economy.
I think that's pretty basic. So what you're saying is that if these corporations like XPO are operating globally and having a negative impact, that's their mission almost on workers, that the workers have to organize globally to take them on.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it depends on the national player to take their responsibility. We have a number of cases.
Expose what they're doing.
We have to say, look, I think for us, one step at a time. So the NLRB, we've got a number of cases against XPO about misclassification of workers in the right jobs. And we're pretty confident we'll win on those. The next issue is that many of the clients sign up for good corporate social responsibility clauses. And we're talking to many of the global transportation companies in different places saying you need to check your audit trail. You need to make sure that when people sign up to your conditions, that you're engaging and vetting, because some of these players
you can also put pressure, can't you, on people like Amazon not to use certain companies because they're not treating their workers correctly.
You can.
Right?
I think the reality is, in today's environment, your brand for a big corporation is a big part of why people buy their stuff. They want to wear certain brands. If you find out that brand has got child labour in the process, or no governance in global supply chain, is discriminating against women in the process, that should be a grave concern for those brands.
You're particularly active on the maritime front, right, in terms of...
Yeah, the ITF has got a long history in maritime, and that's mostly because underneath it all, the International Maritime Organization, which is a governmental body, has produced studies that 90% of all trade takes place on ships.
90%?
90% of all world's goods.
Well, I don't know anything about this, but I always have the impression there's so many of you see these freighters, these great big container ships, and they're getting bigger and bigger, that the workers on those ships probably have horrible conditions and don't make much money, and I don't know. I just have I fear about their working conditions.
So we have.
Am I wrong, or are they?
You're partly right. In reality, the ITF, and again, our chair of our seafarers section, Dave Heindel, is secretary of the Seafarers International Union in North America. Mm-hmm. So there's, when you're a chair of an ITF section, that means you cover the world. You look after everyone. Him, together with our president, who's an Australian, Paddy Crumlin from the MUA, they lead global pay negotiations. So on those big containers that we're talking about, they will go into a room in partnership with the ITF, and they'll sit down with the global employers from Japan, the international group of employers, and we will set a wage for, ships like Maersk and MSC that we're talking about. Yeah. They have ITF agreements. And then that will go down into a local negotiation in the Philippines, India, Russia, Ukraine, and we have set a global model of a wage for the good employers.
Right.
There are many bad employers. And if I said to you that the ITF has something like 150 ITF inspectors in 52 countries visiting ships every day.
Oh.
And over the last...
That's good to know.
In the last 10 years, those inspectors have collected in the region of $313 million in unpaid wages. And that's part of our strategy. On one level, we have a bargaining strategy. It's not so different to a national model gone global. Mm-hmm. For the good guys who are responsible and corporate, we have this level. And then we have sort of a hit squad of ITF inspectors picking on the bad guys, working with the governments in the ports, working with government shipping inspectors, working here in North America with the Coast Guard, implementing what was called the Maritime Labour Convention for those that aren't covered, and ultimately trying to get them union contracts.
Fascinating what you're doing. So important what you're doing, and it's a whole window into a whole area I knew nothing about. I appreciate your coming in, Steve. We're out of time here, but I do want to make sure if people have more questions like I do, there's a place to go, which is itfglobal.org, right?
Yeah, that's it. Perfect.
itfglobal.org. Very, very important. Whether you're a union member or not, you ought to know what they're up to. Thanks, Steve Cotton. Thanks for what you're doing. Thanks
for
for coming in.
My pleasure.
All right.
Thank you.
That's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. Christopher Witko, Kellie Dupree, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.